Welcome back, Rhetoric Warriors podcast. As always, we are teaching the world to teach the world under the guise of rhetoric. We need some cohesion, people. We need to cohere in times of division. So I suppose that's what one of the goals of rhetoric is, to get mass agreement on certain things. I'm Dr. Dan, your friendly neighborhood rhetorician, also stand-up comic. I don't know. I think I'm an emerging guru with three O's at the end of that, like guru. I have things that I kind of like to get into the world that I think are useful. So starting to do that on a more regular basis. The podcast is one version of that. I do three things here. I talk to comedians about their politics and perspectives on the world because they're always different. I convert conservatives because I think they need it. And they're an interesting group. I don't think we understand them very well, and I think we need to. So I have conservatives on and we talk. And I bring on professional influencers, often rhetoricians. I have more rhetoricians on this podcast, I think, than any other podcast. People from other walks of occupation as well. So we'll definitely get into that today. So there's a big persuasion storm kind of looming and hitting right now, as there has been for at least the last year, over public health. And really, it's got a lot of issues embedded in it. But I'm kind of interested right now in the vaccine conundrum. Like, what happens when this vaccine becomes available, as it has, and we just hit 100 million adults vaccinated. But I know people, grown-ups, intelligent, at least slightly rational people, who are refusing flat out to take it. Joe Rogan just told younger people, the hundreds of millions of people, I guess, who listen to Joe Rogan, maybe just millions, that younger people may not need to take it. So my goal is to explore this, and I convene peeps to do that. I bring in different influencer expertises, which brings us to our guest today. It's her second time. You're one of the early adopters of the podcast. Very exciting. Psychiatrist friend of mine, Harvard instructor, Emily Deans is back, and she's going to talk to us about her perspectives on vaccine compliance and such.
Hi, thanks for having me on again. I had a lot of people come to me after our first podcast and kind of thank me. We talked a bit about masks in that podcast, and especially a lot of my healthcare worker friends thanked me and said, wow, you really helped me not be so angry about it, sort of describing why people were rejecting masks, and that frame of reference and understanding can help you always persuade someone, or at least not get quite so frustrated if you empathize with somebody. And just, my stance just as a medical professional and MD is a very pro-vaccine in general. I certainly think,
yeah, you've got a med degree, right? I mean, you actually understand physiology and the body. So
yeah, I have an undergraduate. I have a BS in molecular biology, and then I have a medical doctor degree, both from University of Texas and University of Texas Southwestern. And then you go on to 4 years of psychiatry training after that. So I have a lot of biological background, more than some doctors who weren't science or biology majors before they went to medical school. And to some extent, that makes a difference in what you see people understanding and talking about with respect to the science. I've also, I was just one of those people back in the 90s that was reading all those books like The Hot Zone and about Ebola, and I watched Outbreak and Contagion, and I've just always been fascinated with outbreaks. I have 3 or 4 books on the 1918 flu. There's a really interesting book called A Century of Pandemics that starts with the 1890 Russian flu.
Okay.
And I just think they're fascinating. And
it's interesting though, when you think about that this scenario has lived in our fiction for a long time, and it's lived in a lot of the nonfiction, even outside of academics, like that semi-academic nonfiction world. But then when it sort of exploded here, it's almost like people had no idea that this was even a thing. Like, it hit us out of nowhere with, it wasn't like something that, I guess, that even though there's all this pre-work that we could have looked at and everybody could have been aware that, hey, this could hit America. It's like everybody's like, oh, Ebola, that's Africa. We don't really have to worry about it.
Yeah. And, Ebola is hard to spread, and HIV, for all that it's, it's still in this pandemic spreading stage. You can absolutely, if you abstain from sex, or you can absolutely sort of avoid getting HIV unless you are like a baby born to a mom with HIV or something like that. But there wasn't this respiratory virus, and we dodged a bullet with SARS-1, which happened 2003. And then again, we thought, oh my God, H1N1 is coming back in 2009, 2009. And it ended up kind of being like, so we sort of had dodged two major respiratory bullets in very recent living memory. And so we were just complacent, and, all the stuff that happened with masks and with people doubting that it was very serious and all that kind of stuff, all that happened in 1918. Catherine the Great had to go on a tour to trumpet her, it was a variole or smallpox vaccine, an early version of it, just to get people to do it, and got her own vaccination publicly just to demonstrate. And they actually had a coin minted for her because she, did this early work in promoting vaccines. And I have this, if anybody gets sick or this, there's always some group of people who will blame the vaccines. That's not to say that vaccines are 100% perfectly safe. They are not. They try to make them as safe as possible. They're studied very carefully. They're studied more closely than other pharmaceuticals. You actually have federal watchdogs watching the entire time. The FDA is very careful. That's why they spend 2 weeks with, dozens of scientists, maybe even hundreds, going over 100,000, 200,000 pages of information with these trials before they do the EUA. So, you're getting more care and attention with these vaccines because they're being given to people for prevention, for healthy people for prevention, rightfully so, than you do with pretty much any other FDA approved medication. So it's
this affects everybody. This isn't just a subgroup that maybe has some voice, to get people to pay attention and worry about them, but this is everybody. So it's got a much bigger herd.
Yeah. And, we've never gotten rid of a large scale respiratory disease. Like there's really no such thing sort of as herd immunity without a vaccine. Like RSV, smallpox, measles, flu. The only reason you have peaks or different epidemics of flu is because flu itself mutates out of rotation, because it's a pretty fast mutator in order to kind of keep ahead of everybody's immunity. H influenza, there are all sorts of viruses and bacteria that just keep infecting people over and over and over. So this whole idea that we could just get through this epidemic with such a deadly agent as SARS-CoV-2 without a vaccine, just relying on herd immunity. Look at India, right? It's last day of April 2021, and India still probably has another couple weeks of cases going up before they peak, and it's just a humanitarian disaster there. That's SARS when you don't control it. SARS-CoV-2.
So here's an interesting. So I think even that opening salvo there about you, right? You have clear ethos and expertise in this. It's been developed over decades, formally and informally. You have an interest in this. You work in this. So you would have to give you big ethos, big credibility, right?
I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, and that's
yeah. To arch back more into the rhetoric and persuasion side of things, what I say to a public, now I certainly have a certain element of the public that really likes me and likes how I present things and trusts what I say, but my persuasive capability is 100 times more with my own patients, because I've sat with them, I've listened to them, I know them, I care about them. That's like an ethos,
Yeah,
and that's where the important.
Yeah,
That's the important thing to understand with persuasion of people in general.
So yeah, we get into, so rhetoric is going to look at the whole ecology, right, of influence here. And when you're doing mass influence with strangers versus intimate dialogue based influence with patients, then yeah, you've got a lot of different capacities there. But I think regardless, you've got good ethos in both. You've got a caring ethos. You're clearly wanting good things for people here. You have a expertise ethos, and I think that could play well nationally and with sort of strangers on a big scale if you wanted to do that. It's not really what you do. I know you've done some of that, like when you know, you could we could transfer all this stuff over into food, right? The same resistance issues and the same public sell of, alternative
Yeah.
eating and all that kind of stuff. But so my grid of when I look at persuasion, it's like I have this book that I'm finishing up, 21 Colosseums of Influence or Persuasion. And ethos is just one big coliseum. And I would say you're kind of a good gladiator in there. You're a giant.
Do my best.
Because you bring some good things together. I think people would have a hard time challenging your ethos that you do care about this and you're committed to it and you want good things for people.
Yeah. Certainly there are people who just hear that I'm a psychiatrist and they think that all psychiatrists are quacks. And so that's sort of, if I hear a pushback on something that I say or do, it's just like, oh, yeah, she's a psychiatrist, figures.
Yeah, so they're impugning your entire occupation, not you.
Yeah.
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 For sure. I've got a friend who's a really good, interesting chiropractor, and he doesn't really do, adjustments, but he completely gets impugned from just that occupation. But okay, so like you've got really good, I think, like I said, bona fides and expertise and caring here. And when you look at this differently, like you do some public self, you're on social media and you post about this. Do you still do any kind of speaking or any kind of live, any other sort of public influence work on vaccines, or is it private?
Not really on vaccines. I still do speaking more on my evolutionary psychiatry, the food and mood, parasites, that other stuff. I mean, obviously not this year, but I'll be at the Ancestral Health Symposium in August. It's in LA in 2021. I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about yet, but I'll come up with something.
How would this work from an evolutionary perspective, the vaccine? Like
Yeah,
it's
so
prevention, right? It's this sense of human prevention.
It's part of why I'm fascinated. You know, epidemics in the past have put a huge mark on the human, genome. Like cystic fibrosis evolved and is protective against tuberculosis. We've proved that. So if you think, the majority population that has cystic fibrosis, and one of my cousin's kids has cystic fibrosis, I had a 1 in 8 chance of carrying the gene myself. It's mostly the European population, and they were the ones all up in large cities in cold weather, all spreading TB to each other. So if you're a carrier for cystic fibrosis or you have cystic fibrosis, you're actually protected against TB. You can see how that would be selected for in a population.
Sure.
There's some other gene, like sickle cell anemia is a very famous one. The carriers protected against malaria. And there's some others. MTHFR mutations are very common in everybody except for sub-Saharan Africa, where there's low folates in the soil. They think they're protective against childhood diarrhea illnesses to have some mutations there. So it's just all over our genome. A lot of, how our ancestors escaped through a bottleneck is surviving, some epidemic that would have wiped them out, in these post-agricultural times. So the pre-agricultural humans didn't really face
right, because they weren't all
epidemics. Yeah. There were lots of parasites. So, but it's not like you would have, so maybe malaria, but it's not like you would have RSV or, the flu wipe out, because they didn't have, a lot of these diseases came from herd animals like pigs or cows. So when you didn't have domesticated animals and you didn't have huge groups of people all meeting together, you didn't have these kind of epidemics like we have now. So that, I mean, it all this totally crosses over with a lot of my, interests biologically and evolution and the human genome and behavior. So, and vaccines are clearly, it's an evolutionary adaptation of our intelligence to harness our immune system. And, we don't have polio, we don't have smallpox. Some of them are really smart, like HIV and tuberculosis and malaria, and it's really hard to make vaccines against them, but we're going to figure it out. Haemophilus influenza, when I was in medical school, was pretty much right when that came out. And before that, I was on a peds rotation early in medical school, and there were so many babies with meningitis, with permanent hearing injuries and stuff. And then the vaccine came out, you didn't see another baby with meningitis from H flu. I mean, you don't hear about that. You don't know about it because it's not there, right? But there are a bunch of kids who don't have permanent brain damage and hearing loss or dead because, we have an H flu vaccine now. So that I love vaccines. I think they're fantastic. Vaccines and sewer systems are probably the number 1 and 2 for saving our hides and allowing us to have such a large surviving population.
So again, this is when I listen to you talk from my persuasion landscape perspective, like you've just spent 15 minutes in logos world, like information world. And I learned more about, vaccines and viruses and everything else than I've probably ever known.
Yeah.
Even though I sort of look at this stuff, I'm an intelligent person. I'm not a science person, but I can tell you've got hours of this stuff to talk about.
Oh,
right?
yeah, I could talk about this
Days.
stuff all day. Yeah. And we can go back to the vaccines and persuasion, because I know that was one of the main goals that you wanted to talk about on this podcast. But yeah, I can talk about this stuff forever. Yeah.
No, this is part of it though. So my question is, when you get into logos and you get into logic and information and rationality and all these things that most thinking people value and that they make their decisions through rational channels, and you get good information from a single expert, and then you start exposing your information to other experts and pseudo experts and non-experts, the Joe Rogans, the Tucker Carlsons, or whatever his name is. Logos just mutates, almost like a virus. Like information just becomes so unreliable in people's minds that they check out of that channel.
Yeah.
And so when you do sort of intimate one-on-one talk about vaccines, how much information do people want? Like, are you using information-based persuasion, or are you using sort of a caring and trust me and let me advise you on this type persuasion?
So I test the waters first. So the first thing, if I open some docs will, or the ER or whatever, they're like, you're vaccinated, right? And, what's the correct answer to that to somebody in authority? Yes. Even if you are not, you just don't want, there's a right or the wrong answer. So you have to ask the question in a way that you're prepared to hear, no, I'm not going to get the vaccine, or yes, I am, and to not be judgmental about that. So that's the first step, is you have to ask. So I might, a lot of people, I have patients who are nurses. I know they were already talking to me about they're planning on being vaccinated. So then I might say, oh, hey, how'd your vaccination go? What'd you get? How are your side effects? That kind of thing. But for someone that I'm not 100% sure of, I'll say, so what do you think about the vaccine? And it's part of my sort of public health addressing that I actually bring this up with pretty much every patient. Unless it's a really pressing emergency that we have to talk about something else that session, this is one of the more important things to talk about. Because a lot of people are sort of in between. They're not anti-vax. They're not like eagerly at the front of the line to get the vaccine. They're sort of holding back, waiting, gathering information. There's also an element of, human beings, we don't want to do something, we can kind of put it out of our heads. Like, I'll give somebody a lab slip, but maybe about only 70% of the time people will get the labs done, because it's really easy to not get a blood draw where you have to go to a place and have a needle stuck in you. And vaccines are kind of the same way, especially vaccines with kind of famous side effects. So, addressing that, oh, hey, I am eligible now. I didn't know that. Saying, oh, look, there's one at CVS. It's right down the street from you. Hey, there's openings tomorrow.
Right.
So addressing those hesitancies. But the very first question that I will ask is, what are you thinking about the vaccines? And in general, you'll get three kind of answers from that. The first one is, now in Massachusetts, oh, I'm already vaccinated. I got the Pfizer and this and that. I can wait. And my whole family is. And I'm so, I was glad my 16-year-old got her first shot. And we're planning this and this and this and this. And we saw grandma for the first time. And they're just off to the races and they're super excited about it. The second one is that second group of either, oh, we're eligible now. Well, I've been thinking about it, or, I'm just waiting and seeing. In that group, they've already given you their hook, because in order to persuade someone, you got to have a hook. In some people, it's emotional. Some people, it's general conscientiousness. Some people are more self-motivated for what would be protective for them. So once you get a hook of, oh, I'm interested, tell me more. And some of them actually have questions. How are the vaccines made? What do they do? Do they really reprogram your DNA? They came through so quickly. And that's, I listen to a lot. I know a lot about how the vaccines were tested, how they were made. I know all the technology, just enough to describe it, of what they're like, and where they came from, and how long they've been in use. And when the first studies in Moderna now have been for over a year from the pilot trials, 100 million people have already, you have 100 million guinea pigs in front of you. If they're really waiting for a lot of people to go through, which is probably more than you'll see for most vaccines in a given year. So that person, you can address any of those hesitancies, whether it's that sort of benign, neglect of, oh, is it really, it's my turn to get the vaccine? Oh, okay. Versus, answering some of those Facebook misinformation, to addressing, again, some people have questions. They're a little bit worried about the mRNA vaccine, and they feel more comfortable with the Johnson & Johnson, but what about that clotting thing? So knowing all of that and understanding all of that, I can address that with like a reasoning logos kind of a thing. And then the third group, they'll just, oh, I'm not a vaccine person, or they'll hit you with a whole slew of those talking points,
Right.
One after the other, so you don't even have a chance to kind of chime in, like, oh, they're only good for 6 months, which, that's not true. Pfizer, the data came out, they're still going strong at 6 months. And if you really talk to people who know what they're talking about, it's likely going to be a year or more, that they're going to be good, unless there's some really bizarro variant that comes out. And they'll say, oh, and they were made really fast. They're not really FDA approved, which, they're not. They do not have the official FDA approval is called the BLA, and they're out on an emergency use authorization. But there's tons of data and tons of surveillance. So really, it's very robust. And I think the FDA has actually done a very good job. People have complained they've been a little bit too conservative, but I think they've actually done a good job balancing the questions, the science. And, our FDA, other countries rely on our FDA to do the approval for them. So it's not just for Americans. Israel's waiting on the 12 to 15 authorization for the Pfizer that we're doing before they do their 12 to 15-year-olds. So it's a lot hanging on these scientists there. And they are very dedicated to doing the best job that they can. So I hope with that person too, if I don't want to dig in too much and argue against them, because that they're just going to argue more the other side. And so what I might do with that third group, who's just like, I'm not a vaccine person, or I'm, again, right-wing talking point after right-wing talking point, I'll throw out a couple of different things. So I might tell them, hey, yeah, that they are pretty new. So I'll give them a little bit. I'll be like, they are pretty new. I felt confident enough myself, and I've looked a lot into it, that I got vaccinated, and I sort of felt, I had to protect my patients and older people who are coming in. So I don't necessarily refute directly any of their talking points, but I kind of sidestep around it and start talking about me so they can't get defensive.
Right.
So I'll do that. The other thing to do is just, talk conscientiously about, hey, and your grandmother's in the nursing home. Have you been able to visit? Oh yes, but we still have to wear masks and blah, 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 blah. And some are just more, they don't really care about grandparents or anything like that, but eventually they want to travel internationally. And so sometimes I might bring up, hey, waiting now is an option, but in the future, I bet we won't be able to leave the country without that card. And so I just throw that out there so they just start thinking. I don't say you must go out and get the vaccine, because it just doesn't work.
Yeah. So it's a pretty multivariate environment in this persuasion ecology.
Yes, I hope I didn't throw out too many big chunks for you to take apart. The science of rhetoric, I actually know nothing about it, only my practice of it in medicine. So hearing you like carve it up and talk about it is really interesting to me.
Yeah. And, everybody informally studies persuasion because you need it in your life to get anything done. With your family, you learn how to persuade your kids, like kids learn how to persuade their parents. And
threats and bribes usually.
Yeah, all the everything's on the table with influence, and human beings will find what works. That's part of our nature. With your stuff, like there's never too much. Like that's why I said it's a multivariate environment. Like these things get really, really complicated, and when you go across targets, so if you localize this all the way down into individuals, like when I talk about converting conservatives, I get a lot of immediate blowback from, well, what's a conservative? I'm like, well, it's a lot of different things. Sometimes I just call it the right because it's traditional conservatives, which are recognizable throughout history, and most, almost every country has conservatives. It's people who like to go slow. They don't like a lot of change. They like traditions. They like that, sort of more stay with what we are, move slowly kind of approach. But then there's, sort of the MAGA, and then there's Trump, and then there's the GOP, and all these subdivisions within the right. And each one has to be persuaded differently. Because some of it's just opportunism. Some of it's just, hey, we found a type of rhetoric that works for somewhat, isolated or paranoid or suspicious or hate-filled people. And if we run this past them, they vote for us.
Yeah. The oppositional defiance. Yeah.
And, that's one of the things I'm curious about with you, like because all this resistance and all the responses and all the different patterning that people have in their talk, I would think you can also tie back to psychological traits or states that they're in. So if you see somebody that's accepted like hardcore anti-vax, like almost the full conspiracy paranoia of this is a tracking device from Bill Gates. Like to me, that's the far limit, of the resistance. It's a tracking device. The government is tracking us with this, Bill Gates, China, all that kind of stuff. Would you tie that into, so there's, let's say, a stable psychology over here, and then there's kind of a mixy, a little iffy, and then there's the far extreme. I mean, you're going into abnormal psych. Would you call that abnormal psychology at that level?
It's an interesting question because, certainly I've seen and talked to people over the many years with delusional disorder or schizophrenia, and they tend to have this more concrete thinking, a lot more paranoia, just sort of how they think. And you will get these very, sometimes quite bizarre ideation out of them. And, actually, when you speak with somebody who's very delusional, meaning delusional from a psychiatric perspective, you actually don't try to dissuade them from their delusions. It's a fixed, the definition of an illusion is a fixed false belief. It's fixed. And again, the more you try to dissuade them, the more they're going to dig in or try to prove the case. And the last thing I want as a psychiatrist is my patient proving their delusions to me.
Right. You don't want them
Right?
working to make the delusion better.
That's like the wrong direction, right? So I talk more about, you don't tell them that it's true, but and there's more data too about late stage dementia, not saying, oh no, whatever is dead, you're here, you're not at home. You don't spend all your time like disappointing them over and over.
Right.
You spend your time either sort of talking about what they're missing in so if they're saying, where's your father or whatever, you can talk about dad, even though he's passed. You can bring that up because that's like the emotional tenor of what the demented person is bringing up. Or you can talk about the old house. And with the delusional person, often you might be the only person they can tell about this because you're their psychiatrist and everybody else is sick of it. And so you let them kind of talk about it, but then you talk about the emotions around it. Wow, that sounds really awful to have to, deal with feeling that that's happening or whatever it is. You sort of dance around saying that it's true or not say that it's true and not denying it, but it's more about the emotions that's interesting and how you connect with that person than the actual content.
Right.
When you're talking about sort of like a mass shared delusion or a meme that's or like a cue, that's
right.
or a cult, that's a little bit different. And it's actually a problem with people who are delusional for other reasons, because they'll latch on to something and then go find it on the internet. And all of a sudden there's hundreds of other people with the same stuff. And that just reinforces it. And even if you're not delusional per se, you don't have a psychiatric delusional disorder, we can all, just because of human psychology, how we're designed, we're all vulnerable to that kind of thinking. And I personally think it goes back to the fact that we used to live in small groups, small tribes. And if you had someone in charge who had a certain belief, they were your charismatic leader, you believe that too. Imagine how many little towns, in a little hamlet in the mountains in Europe or somewhere in Africa or somewhere in the West where they had very little contact with the outside world. If they had some preacher or shaman in charge and they had some idiosyncratic, crazy idea, everybody would be spouting that idea, even if they didn't believe it necessarily. And some people would hear that idea over and over and just believe it as true. So it's sort of this cross between like religion and culture and society and the human psychology, to survive, so that the leader doesn't come out against you and persuade other people to come against you. We're sort of trained with our psychology to sometimes go along. And that's why we're vulnerable to joining cults and all of those things. So,
and I think you find too, like, again, the way this sort of jumps over into language and messaging and mediums and propagation of belief is that those people are good storytellers. They're good at creating images. They're good at creating villains to worry about and being the hero that can save people. And I think one of the things that's happened to us, this massification of those sort of idiosyncratic talents, happens in the digital media. Almost anybody can bring enough production skill now to the media and enough production sophistication with the cameras, and it's so easy to produce things on Instagram that look like, it looks like a glossy magazine. It looks like a short episode of a TV show, and it gains all this credibility. So you're kind of finding all these old storytelling techniques and all these stories like Q and conspiracies and vampires sucking the blood of children and all this stuff emerging back through the technology into our mass messaging, and it's having the same effects that it has when it's done really well on a local level.
Yeah. And I remember I read this somewhere, so I'm not going to take credit for it myself, but in the past, the only image you ever saw, this before most people even had mirrors, was that all the kings and queens would have their image on the coins, right? And they were the big celebrities. And now, the people you saw later, people you saw in the movies, they became very famous and had a lot of power in their own way because everyone knew their image. And now everybody can put their image out everywhere. And it's very interesting what that does to the importance we give things, and again, the gravitas we give things and whether we trust that person or not.
Yeah, and I tell people all the time that social media and all this stuff, it seems it's recycling a lot of human communication, so it seems familiar to us, but it's a whole new environment. No human cultures have ever done this. This instant communication, spread of information this fast, stories this fast. It's never been done. There's no professional gatekeepers on the communication. It's just at speed, completely chaos. Anybody can get into it. It becomes a really interesting environment from a sort of gatekeeper or rhetorician perspective, because rhetoricians, typically will be like, oh, these are the ethical techniques and the things that have good moral outcomes, ways of talking. And here are the ones that we should avoid. But it's all just a big herd, interpenetrated herd now, and it's really hard to control.
Yeah, it is. I think what strikes me too is that how all of a sudden now you have to have an instant opinion on everything that ever happens, especially news events. Like when a news event happens, or almost always the first stuff that comes out is wrong, and yet we have to make some statement about the cultural implications of what this happened, even when we don't even have. And I just know from being a psychiatrist and dealing with a lot of people who've gone through a lot of stuff, like being fired or being arrested, or often there's a lot of history and there's a lot of stuff that never becomes public and isn't known, and it can be messy on both sides. And so I just hate that pressure or in commenting on things unless we really know a lot or is very, very obvious. But there's a tremendous amount of pressure. And if you end up on the wrong side or you're silent, all of a sudden there's this whole tribal pressure that's against you. And it's pretty distressing to me, just as a psychiatrist.
I think that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in talking to other influencers or people who are working in some, at least somewhat influence occupations like yours, is that you have opportunities to bring people into a one-on-one session, talk to them over time, repetitive interactions, and make real effect on those people. And you've developed a lot of different skills and techniques and theories of how to do that because you do it so much. And if we harvest from some of that, like here's how a psychiatrist influences, and you've done a really nice job of handing some of that out about, I like doing relational persuasion. Like the whole thing becomes creating a good relationship before you go after anybody's logic or their stories or anything else, because without that relationship, they can't lock in with you.
And I do have to say I'm also willing to accept that answer of no, I'm not getting the vaccine, and not run screaming and not saying, I can't believe you're this way. That's ridiculous. Like, I'm not going to say that. They know that, so they can trust me to tell me the truth. I've also talked with, again, and I think in the vast majority of cases, it's definitely to people's benefit to get the vaccination. There are a couple cases where, us talking about it together, and I can't, that's too specific to talk about why, I might advise a person, in the very few cases that I have, to say, hey, you know what, I agree with you, probably it's not the right time or where you should do it right now. And they.
Do you mean biologically they're compromised in some ways towards the vaccine, or?
So there could be biological, and there are also sometimes psychological or other reasons, and where, when you really go over all the risks and benefits, that it probably, in an informed consent discussion with this person, that you're sort of, okay, we'll keep revisiting this, but for right now, let's shelve it. And I think that you make good points, and so if you're willing to do that and to have that real discussion with someone, that I think that increases the trust, because I'm not just, being paid by Moderna to push their vaccine on people. I'm going to tell them what I think. Right. And they know that.
Well, it's also, again, the way we discredit people, like being paid to push Moderna becomes like everybody looks for the self-interest in your persuasion. And that's what I was saying earlier. You have a good ethos because I mean you're getting paid by your patients and things like that. It's your occupation, but I don't really think it ends up discrediting. People use it to discredit any type of service, even a
Yeah.
human service. But you're to me like the whole vaccine challenge. When you look down into the percentage of the population that has strong resistance to it. And you start to partition that out and go, okay, here's maybe 20 different reasons, strong reasons why we have a really tough time getting through the gristle in these people's minds to get them to take the vaccine. And that's what's going to come down to, right? We're going to end up having to fight through these smaller populations to get them to take the vaccine.
Yeah, and there was an interesting article in the New York Times, I think last week or the week before. It was about the difference between men and women. Like men have 10% less uptake on the vaccine than women do in the US. Partly that's because they're more older women, and also 70 to 75% of the healthcare workers are women. So we just got it offered earlier. But there's also just in vaccines in general, for the tetanus and all those kinds of things and pneumonia and stuff, women are more likely to get preventative health care. And I'm completely a pragmatist on this issue. They did some screenings on these men who were not getting vaccinated, and they found that if a woman told them, put on that white coat and told them to get vaccinated, that almost made them not want to get vaccinated more. But so for them, people were talking about tailoring messages for men, that they were willing to
Sure.
listen to men. And again, I'm a pragmatist. I don't, whatever works. If
that's
I was joking, if people don't want a vaccine because they're true MAGA, I'm like, put the little Trump bouffant on the syringe and get them a little MAGA vaccinated hat. I don't care. Any way that people will get it. So men is one group. Evangelicals are another group. And I've had this talk with some people about the use of fetal cells in the making of the vaccines, and what, the Pope said it was okay, and the other different groups. But for some people in that group, you're never going to get the
well, the Pope was grown from fetal cells. Do they know that? He was actually grown in
Aren't
a
we all?
lab.
You're never going to get buy-in from having Dr. Fauci talk to this. They need an elder in their group. So
Right.
going in, the health people going into a Hasidic Jewish temple and talking to the rabbi and hoping that perhaps he can be influenced, or again, going to elders or somebody in their own who looks like them, talks like them, really understands them. And again, like as a psychiatrist or doctor for my patients, they're sort of the spiritual equivalent of someone that they know and that they trust.
Right.
And that's the only way you're going to bring in some of those. The other way to vaccinate is to make it super available. So the Johnson & Johnson one and done, have them at every emergency room, have them at, homeless shelter. I know they've gone.
Make it an impulse buy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you look into advertising, the way advertising, all the things it's developed to get people to all the way through conversion, like that, like, oh, it's there, sure, whatever. And it's amazing, like when you actually go into all the little psychological tricks that selling has developed, just import some of that stuff over, and you're starting to see some of it. Like West Virginia, the governor, they're giving them $100.
$100.
It's like, there you go. That's
And there's some ethical things about that, but I think the danger is so much that I'm not too bothered by that. I remember retweeting somebody the other day. Kilgore Trout is this, I love that account on Twitter. And because someone had put up, there had been like a Bud Light ad or some sort of ad, or a bar ad. And it was like, get your shot and we can all have shots together, or some, really simple,
right,
concise, really snappy they said, why can't the CDC come up with something like this? And Kilgore Trout retweeted that and said, marketing degrees.
Yeah, it's, I tell people this all the time. We've talked about this before in Paleo FX. Like the alternative health industries do not really harvest from all the other influence industries very well. They end up saying the same things over and over again. Like, I'm like, if you're trying to get food and eating change from people, especially when again you get down to the gristle of people that are stuck in a habituation, or can't overcome compulsions and urges to eat and all this stuff, you need more than just just keep at it. And
Yeah, they
there's
have this
tons
whole
of stuff to
purity culture
harvest,
thing. Yeah,
and some
yeah.
of it is unethical. Like, that's why the Rhetoric Warriors brand is about ethical only persuasion, because there's plenty of strength there. Like, you don't have to go over to unethical techniques to get wins. You just need to be sophisticated in what you're doing over on the ethical side. Like, to me, like, unethical persuasion is just lazy persuasion. Like, you can go to it easily. I know how to make somebody afraid if I want to, but that's not as clean an influence technique.
It sure is easy for conservatism though, because if you're afraid, you don't want to change, right? You want to
I,
hide back and not move forward.
I mean,
Yeah.
I can't. Here's the thing: you can't stop unethical persuasion because it's effective. And the fact that the right, the extreme right, from the all the way from Nixon through, the Tea Party, and even Reagan, and all that stuff has been using fear tactics for a long time because they're effective in politics. It's like, fine, they're going to use that. You can't stop it, but you can counter it. There are ways to counter it. There's ways to hamstring it. There's ways to weaken it. It's not going away. But to me, like, you have to understand what those are, and you make your choices to stay ethical. Like, you have very ethical influence foundations, clearly. Even you balking there about $100, yeah, and that kind of stuff, because it's unethical to pay somebody to do something that they don't believe in.
Right. Yeah.
But
And you also you wonder about the downside. What if you have people going to get multiple vaccinations because they'll get hundreds of bucks, or something
sure,
like that, where you can incentivize some pretty dangerous behavior if you don't think about it. I'm sure that they have, it's related to this batch. It was a savings bond. So it's not like you're going to give one person $2,500 savings bonds. It's not like $100 cash that you're not
right.
tracking, but
And that's why I said, like, it's multivariate environment. There's a lot going on in the environment, the ecology of this issue. And when you go back to rhetorical principles, like you were talking about earlier, one of the easiest ones and one of the strongest ones, if you look at a rhetorical ecology of what you can do in that ecology, like what you can move around, just change the source. Same message, same ask, same goals, and everything else. Just keep changing out sources until one hits. So, like, having an evangelical who's respected come out and be like strongly pro-vaccine would be effective for a lot of that population. Then it's just persuading the source to do it.
yeah. And I don't worry about college kids so much, because they're used to, they have to get all their vaccines just to do, and now they're making them go to college. A lot of them want to travel overseas. So I think they're all going to I don't think Joe Rogan is going to have that much of an influence on them, because they're going to have to get vaccinated anyway. And if anybody I'm sure employers will start to mandate it down the line. Certainly in healthcare, they will. So
yeah, there's going to be some power enacted on this at some point, right? I mean, where
yeah.
you just don't have a choice. If you want this is the requirement.
And from a conservative perspective, some of the oldest powers of the state, before they did anything for you, was that they enforced quarantines. And they
Public health, right? I mean,
yeah, it was like the first function of government. So when people argue that it's not a conservative thing, I'm like, it's the conservative.
it's controlling your behavior. Come on.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. Well, what else, like, when you look at this, just to kind of, if you were giving people a few principles to use, just in general, like from a psychological perspective, if you're dealing with, say, a family member or somebody that's hesitant, I think you did a really nice job of saying, the relationship is what's important. Like, don't confront them on the content, because you're going to lose and they're going to retrench and all that. Anything else other than, that sort of empathic listening and that kind of acceptance and validation?
One, you're going to be a lot more empathic if you walk in there already accepting that their answer may be no, that it's not a zero-sum game, and that maybe you've just started them along the pathway of thinking about it. And then the second thing is to find that hook. So some people, and we talked about this at our last podcast, some people are conscientiously driven. And so you can talk about, hey, they really didn't know about this before, but now they've shown that, people who've had the vaccine spread the virus 10 times less than other people, even 10 days after the first shot, or, whatever the data, simple stuff like that. And so some people will be conscientiously driven, or, you talk about Nana in the nursing home and visiting them. And so that emotional hook can help. And it could be even that hook to you to say, like, look, we have this family member. I have an occupation where I see elderly people. I can't really be going to your dinner parties, Marge. If you don't get vaccinated, well, cases are high. So, you can use you as the emotional hook, even though, again, you have to be able to hear that no and not take it too personally if they say that no, if they're too afraid or something like that. And if people aren't conscientiously driven, again, you can just sort of talk about things or talk about your own reasons for getting vaccinated, so that maybe there's some mirroring going on there, that they can they're too defended to think about it for themselves, but they can start to think about it as someone like you. A lot of psychological techniques are taught. If people are too defended to think about it themselves, you talk to them about, oh, hey, remember on Breaking Bad, the kid who was really struggling with addiction, and you do it in displacement. So that's an old trick to get people talking and thinking about something that's really about them, but it's less. They're not too defended to talk about it. They can talk about the characters in Breaking Bad when they can't talk about themselves, right? This is better sometimes for younger people as well, and kids. You can talk about the Power Rangers or something like that rather than the teacher.
Yeah, I think that's really like when I dial things down in rhetoric to tactics like that, like very specific micro techniques, and that's a great one, like, because it takes all the personal, shame and judgment and all that stuff out of it. Now you're just talking about a story, and they can get the lesson from the story. Most people will make those inferences. They can pull out those, those conclusions from the story. So displacement and things like that are useful ones. And you were talking about this, like a lot of this, I think, is when you adapt an identity or adopt an identity yourself, like a persuader or influencer identity, like you've got a strong helper psychiatrist identity. And it allows you to go, yes, I need this skill set to do my job with these people. And so, like, when I teach people like a rhetorician identity or persuader identity, part of it is to realize, when I give some sort of strategy or theory orientation of this, like there are yes, there's 4 corridors of people's reaction. There's yes people, and there's no people. Then there's yes, no, and no, yes. And yes has a lot of yes, no has a lot of yes in there, but there may be 20% no, maybe no, yes, maybe 20, 30% no, but there's a lot of yes. And you have to look at it that way. Like your job is really just adding yes and reducing no. And if you can get that kind of perspective on it, then it takes the emotionality out of it. You get less frustrated. Your expectations change, because
Or
that's how human beings are.
stepping further back. My goal is just to get them thinking about the possibility of getting vaccinated instead of just saying no way. My end goal is not to get them vaccinated at that moment. It's just to get them thinking about it. And if you just have that approach, it's a lot less, the interaction is almost always better.
Yeah, and you're pulling out planks. You're not trying to do the whole persuasion at once. It's divided into planks. So there's separate sub issues going on there, like that one, just to not reject the entire idea of a vaccine for any human being at any time in history. Because
most people are not that. There are a few.
Right.
I'm not a vaccine person, whatever it is, fine. And I don't actually waste a lot of time trying to persuade them, because it might damage the relationship really if I push too hard.
Yeah, they can't take too much.
And I don't think it would. They're not going to get vaccinated anyway, so why am I wasting my time? But all these other, the no yeses and the yes nos, there's a lot of room.
Yeah.
To push them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's, like when you expand it like you did at the very beginning of this about look at all the viruses and human issues that have happened throughout time and, the polio vaccines and all these different things that have had good effect so that people expand the world. They're not just fighting you on this vaccine that's being slandered, by a certain segment of the population. So it's being attacked, but nobody's attacking the polio vaccine at the moment, right?
Not right now. No.
I'm sure they did, but
Yeah.
it's got a pretty dramatic visual impact of its threat. So it's most people are like, no, I don't want my kid to be crippled. That's a pretty bad
Yeah.
outcome.
That was another tweet that Kilgore Trout did, was like, want my kids in an iron lung to own the libs,
Right.
because there was that article, this young, you could tell, I mean, I could just tell that these were like frat boys laughing, and it's like, what's the most annoying article headline we could write? And it was something like, I'm not getting the vaccines because it makes liberals mad. That was literally a headline for this conservative paper. Right. And you could just say, oh, they're just trolling. And that's part of how, you can just get your head all red. Tucker Carlson and the people that he has on there, their whole agenda is to piss me off. And I'm not going to give them that power over me. So I'm just like, oh, he's just a disgusting ghoul troll. And I just don't let it get to me, because because then I don't want Tucker Carlson to have power over me.
Yeah, well, that's my thing. Like I curate all my social media and my media use very, very carefully because I have zero desire. I can never remember his name. I know it's Tucker, and I can remember that squinchy face of his, but I have zero desire for anything he ever says to live in my head. And I'll look at all conservative arguments and approaches and all that other stuff. But when it comes through the media, the produced media, that kind of hyper produced media, it has too much power to burn into your brain because it does emotionality, it does the visuality. He's a super talent, on camera doing that kind of thing.
It's very highly refined propaganda. It's very powerful. Yeah.
And so I prefer not to expose my brain to it.
That's probably for the best.
Well, this has been super fun again. I think, like I said, it's always useful to go into somebody that thinks about this a lot and has your science background, and you're like, this is my occupation to try to bring people to healthy decisions in life. So
yeah, I'm greatly honored to be one of your second time yes people. But yeah, I find this stuff fascinating. And to be honest, I never really thought of it in terms of rhetoric before, actually, our first podcast very much. I mean, I know that I find it fascinating to combine my expertise and then also what I do just for a living as a psychiatrist in all realms of helping people with health changes. Oh, do they need medicines? Can we taper off medicines? What's going wrong? How can I help you talk to your mother-in-law better? All the stuff that I do as a psychiatrist. And then this other realm of academic rhetorics and the techniques and the names and, that I use all the time, but I never studied. So it's just really interesting to me.
Yeah, when you start adding in all the Greek terms for all this stuff, then you get really geeky about it. It's like the Greeks studied this stuff so long ago. They have like 300 terms for all these little tricks. The tropes of language, which end up burrowing into people's brains that Fox News uses and all this stuff. Language is limited, and we've developed all these techniques. They're just regurgitating it over and over again, which is why, like, to me, like if I can get people where they have at least a baseline awareness of what rhetoric offers, it offers the counters and the antidotes too. It's just nobody has those. So they end up in these arguments, these logocentric arguments with people whose logos has been, unanchored. It's been re-anchored over into something else. And you're never going to win that.
Yeah, no.
But if you simply go, hey, I'm not going to win in logos, I'll just move over here to relationship like you're doing. And I'll be like, hey, you know what? I care about you. I care about, whether you're healthy and whether, your people around you are healthy. Then you've got a new avenue and people can hear that sometimes better. So
yeah, that's a much better place to persuade people from, to be. It's just a much more powerful place. Maybe not in the mass but certainly one-on-one.
No,
Yeah.
it's still in the mass. Like that's the thing about celebrities. Celebrities have
Right. Yeah, I guess.
weird
Yeah.
virtual relationships, intimate relationships with people.
Yeah. So if
That's why they're
Beyonce
so
told me to get
powerful.
vaccinated, I probably would. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool. Thanks again. I appreciate it. It's super fun.
All right. Have a great weekend.
All
Take
right,
it
everybody.
easy.
That is Emily Deans on the Rhetoric Warriors podcast. Get out there and do some persuasion. Clearly, people always need it.